I don't know. Those three words can make us feel inadequate, unprepared, and even foolish. But what if the words "I don't know" might be exactly the right answer to some of the questions of faith? This morning, the story we heard Kira read to us from the gospel is about a man born blind. He knew that he was blind for his entire life. He encountered someone named Jesus who did something, and now he's not blind. That is what the man knows. So then he's dragged before the religious leaders who want theological explanations and doctrinal precision in his answers. They demand that he explain the mysteries of God and condemn the person who healed him miraculously. So his response to those questions: I don't know whether he's a sinner. What I do know, I was blind and now I see. I don't know the answers to all of these doctrinal questions you have about the Sabbath and if he's the Son of God, but I do know he healed my life. That short testimony is a changed life. And it's good news that he could share because he had a life-changing encounter with God in the form of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. He did not have all the answers, but he had enough to tell his story. And that's the beautiful truth that we can take from this gospel lesson this morning. We do not need to know everything there is to know about God before we can share our testimony, before we can witness to the glory of God, before we can share our story of walking with God in this life. Each one of us is significant and has a story to share, and our stories matter. There is someone in this world that needs to hear your story of how you have encountered God in this life. And this formerly blind man tells us that sometimes all we need to do is tell what we know, and then it's okay to say, I don't know. Now, sometimes it means I don't know, and we'll turn to this religious expert and see what they have to say, because there are people who have given their whole lives to wrestling with the question of evil. For if God is good, how can there be evil in the world? There are people who have spent their lives questioning, what is atonement? How does God make us righteous? There are questions about when do we observe the Sabbath? There are deep questions, and there are lots of theologians who have wrestled with them. But we don't need to have those answers before we tell our stories of how our lives were changed. So this formerly blind man shows us that we can simply tell what we know, and it is enough. Now, the Pharisees, they weren't satisfied. The Pharisees were the religious leaders who dragged this person before them, and they wanted to know his opinion. Where is Jesus from? Is Jesus a sinner? And how exactly did this miracle happen? They wanted comprehensive theological explanations about Christology. Was Jesus really the Son of God? Or was he just a human doing magic tricks? They wanted comprehensive answers about how exactly the miracle happened in his body. But he was not a religious scholar who could talk to them about the Sabbath. He was not someone who could explain everything they wanted to know. But what he could do was tell his story of what he knew. He was blind, but now he could see. So the story that Kira read for us, I originally was thinking, we should just focus in on that beginning, but it wasn't the full story. And that's why she actually read the entire chapter for us. Because we see that Jesus broke one of the commandments in this healing act. Now, for us, it's easy to skip over that fact because we don't often think about observing the Sabbath in the same way that the people of Jesus' time would have. But Jesus was a Jew, and he observed the Sabbath, one of the 10 commandments, to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy, which meant he was not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath day. But that's something remarkable in this story, is that Jesus makes mud. That was an act of work. When he made mud on the Sabbath, he broke the religious law in order to heal this man. The Pharisees almost miss the miracle of a person born blind who now can see because they are focused on the rules and regulations of their faith. This man has been begging on the side of the road for so long because he could not see and earn a living for himself, and now he is miraculously healed. That is good news to share. But the Pharisees don't care about that good news. They don't care about that healing. They care about the fact that Jesus made mud on the Sabbath, so he broke the law. Jesus cares more about transforming lives than following religious protocol. Jesus is more interested in setting people free than maintaining the status quo of what humans think makes us good and right and holy. And so we encounter a man whose life is changed, and he knows how to tell his story of what he knows, and it is enough. We have stories to tell too. We can follow in this man's footsteps. So in his story, he tells his personal experience. He doesn't quote scripture or recite doctrine. He simply says, I was blind. This was my life. This is what happened to me. And then he's specific. He says, he put mud on my eyes, I washed, and now I see. He doesn't speak in general terms, but he speaks in concrete detail. And finally, there's undeniable truth to his story. There are neighbors and even his parents who could testify to the fact that he could not see, and then now he clearly can. None of those people could deny the truth of his story. And so that blind man who was not theologically trained, who didn't have any particular skill set for public speaking, now had a testimony of a story of what Jesus did and changed his life. And he was willing to acknowledge he didn't know how it happened. He just knew that it had happened. And so when we follow stories and how God worked in our lives, we can follow this same pattern. We witness to our faith simply by naming our experience of where we have encountered God in our lives. This is what was happening in my life. This is how God or Jesus changed that. And then this is now the truth I tell to you. Too often, we think of telling our faith, of witnessing, of sharing our testimony or evangelism. Too often we think that means having the perfect answer to every question of theology, or somehow being equipped to argue people into believing what we believe. But this man shows us a different way. Real testimony, real witness is simply saying, here is what I was like before I encountered God, and here's what happened when I encountered God, and here is how my life is different. When we encounter God's love for us, it is a beautiful and wondrous thing. But you may not have a dramatic story, such as this miraculous healing. Maybe your testimony is more about being in a place of anxiety and finding a peace that passes all understanding. Even while sitting in the NICU, even through cancer treatments, even through the unknown certainty of the future. Moving from anxiety to peace. Maybe your story is about moving from addiction to freedom and talking about how every day is still the choice to choose freedom, to choose God's love again and again. Maybe your testimony is about moving from loneliness to belonging, to knowing that you are part of a church family, that you have a place to call a spiritual home. Maybe it's about moving from despair to hope, to finding purpose to your life because you see how God can use you to make a difference in this world. Or maybe it's about selfishness to generosity, how God has grown the capacity of your heart through the opportunities to give of your time, your talents, your treasures. Whatever it is, there is someone who needs to hear your exact story so that they can find themselves in the story of God. As United Methodist, we believe that grace works in a couple of different ways in our lives. There's the grace that goes before us, that prevenient grace that allows us to say yes. At that moment when we embrace God's love for ourselves and we celebrate that justifying grace. And then for the rest of our lives, the sanctifying grace of God works in us to increase the love and decrease the sin in our life. So maybe your story involves decades of sanctifying grace, talking about how the fruit of the Spirit is in you today in a way it wasn't 30 years ago. Your story does not have to be dramatic to be true. Your story is not a commodity that you're trying to sell to others. This is a conversation to witness to your faith. This is not trying to convert someone else's heart. Because you see, that man who offered his testimony, he didn't convert those Pharisees. His incredible, miraculous healing, that was not enough for them to witness to the same faith he now shared in Jesus. We saw that the religious leaders expelled him from the synagogue. They were not converted by it. But his story was true. His story was his, and his story was enough for Jesus to find him again, and then to let him in on the love of God in a new way. And for the rest of that man's life, he had a testimony to tell. Maybe somebody would have heard that blind man and think, if God could heal him, maybe God can heal me too. This gospel passage challenges us to consider how we live in response to what God has done. As Christians, we have an opportunity to share our story so that others can find a place where they can encounter God. We do not emphasize the opportunity of telling our story of the life-changing love of Jesus simply so that someone can get their ticket to heaven when that day comes. We believe that there is a fullness to being a disciple of Jesus that transforms us in this world, that makes a difference today, that leads to life eternal. This man had that moment of incredible transformation, and he was so grateful for it that gratitude turned into courage. He became bold, and he said to those Pharisees, "You don't know where this man is from, and yet he healed my eyes." He had a boldness and a courage to tell his story that made a difference in this world as well as the next. When we have stories of faith, it's an opportunity to witness to the abundant love of God that makes a difference today and here and now. We can choose love over fear, we can choose grace over judgment, and we can share our testimonies of transformation, whether it is a dramatic moment like this man, or it is that sanctifying grace that has worked in us over the days and weeks and years and decades of our lives. This is the discipleship to which all of us are called. To live aware of what God has done in our lives, and then to share that good news with others. But what stops us from sharing our stories? What stops us from having the boldness and the courage to talk with others? Sometimes it is a fear of not knowing enough, of thinking we need to be an expert in all things before we can talk about it. And frankly, often today, that is the expectation, because in this age of Google and ChatGPT, people will sit and Google something you say immediately, and then they'll have their argument against you. So it can be intimidating. But this gospel message reminds us that there are times when we can simply say, I don't know. But what I do know is this, and what I know is enough. Sometimes we don't want to share our story because we're afraid of judgment. This man's own parents were afraid to speak up because they knew the consequences that they could be expelled from the synagogue. And so they said, well, he's old enough, ask him yourself. Sometimes we're afraid that sharing our story may cost us a relationship, may cost us the status in a community. And for this man, it did cost him his place in that synagogue. But then Jesus came and found him again after that expulsion. And the relationship that he gained is worth far more than he lost. As a church community, how do we create a place where people feel safe sharing both their struggles and their celebrations, knowing that we will not expel them like this man was from the synagogue? We start by listening more than we speak. The Pharisees, they kept asking questions, but they weren't really listening for the real answer. They kept pressing him because they wanted him to be in trouble. But when Jesus asks questions, he listens to the answers. So we as a church can receive stories with gratitude. We can listen to how God has worked in a person's life, and we can resist the urge to correct their theology if it doesn't quite match our own. How can we receive the story of their testimony as a gift? As we reflect on this passage, we are called to be authentic witnesses and share our story. And we are also called to be a church where other people are comfortable about being honest of what God has done in their life, about sharing the authentic story of how they met God and the struggles they have and how God helps them through that. This man that was born blind ends his story by worshiping Jesus. After all of those questions, all of the pressure, all of the conflict, he returned to the simple truth. Jesus gave him sight, and Jesus is worthy of worship. And that's where our stories lead. Not to pride in our own transformation, but our stories always lead us to point back to Jesus, the one who brings us the grace that we don't deserve and yet is ours abundantly, where we can boast about the generosity of God who gave to us. When we live grounded in our experience of God's grace, we can be honest about both our struggles and our celebrations. We can be generous with what we've been given, and we can celebrate when we have a story to tell. When we see others in our community who have a story, we can receive that with gratitude. Now, we may not have all the answers. We may not be able to explain every aspect of theology. There's lots of scholars who have done lots of work, and they sometimes come down on very different sides of a perspective. Because the reality is, the ineffable God, the God who is bigger than all words, we can attempt to explain and to use scripture, tradition, reason, and experience to have some certainty in our faith. But when it comes down to it, there is so much about God that is a mystery at the heart of it all. But what we can say is what God has done in our lives and the difference that Christ has made. And what we know is enough. Not just for ourselves to love and cherish that story, but to share with someone else who needs to hear it. So friends, your story matters. There is someone who needs to hear your story so that they can find their place in the story of God. Whether or not it's dramatic like the story today, whether or not it answers every theological question, as long as it is true and it is your story, that is enough. So somewhere in your workplace, in your neighborhood, maybe even your family, there is someone struggling with something that you have struggled with. They need to hear how God met you in that place. They need to hear that transformation is possible. They need your story to help them believe that they too can encounter God for themselves. So what you know is enough. Live it, share it, and celebrate it. Because the story of God's grace is always worth sharing. and it's an opportunity to invite others to join you in this story too. This morning, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to reflect on our gospel. You may choose to journal. There's some blank space in the bulletin if you like to write, or you may choose to turn to a neighbor to look at the text and maybe to reflect on one of these questions. In what way has God transformed me, and how am I living differently because of that change? Based on how God has been working in my life, what is one specific way I sense God calling me to grow or serve in the coming month? And what would it look like for our community to become a place where people feel safe, sharing both struggles and celebrations? What barriers might prevent authentic storytelling, and how can we intentionally remove them? Let's share now what God is saying to us today.